Before I actually start presenting any information, just a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I am an ally. I'm not part of the LGBTQ community, but I have many valued friends within that community and have felt like for a long time the church needs maybe some help in navigating that a little better. And in my opinion, of course, being much more accepting and affirming of the queer community. And thank you, Randy, for being today. I appreciate that, and I've really valued getting to know you through Kinship. And I am involved with Kinship. I'm on the advisory council of Kinship, and love to attend camp meeting. Didn't make it this year, but maybe when it's back on the West Coast, I'll be able to be there. And also, I am on my own campus here at Pacific Union College. My wife and I are the sponsors for the campus's official GSA. That's a gay straight alliance. We call it GASP, which is gay and straight people, is what that acronym stands for. And we try our best to make a safe place here on our campus for our queer students, and have had a great time getting to know many of them and trying to help them too navigate the church, because that's always somewhat difficult. And then, of course, in my own family, I have a child who is gay and considers themselves to be non-binary. As well as I have some grandchildren that are in various parts of that community as well. So I'm pretty well acquainted with it, even on a firsthand basis, which you kind of find in the LGBTQ plus community and among those who are allies, that often they have family members that have helped them to understand it better. For me, it didn't take that at first. Being a geneticist and understanding something about genetics, very early on, and I can't say I was always an affirming member of this community, but I had questions very early on, and genetics certainly brings those up. So today I hope, and so I say welcome to my genetics class today, is all I have to say, because there will be some technical material. I'll do my best to try and simplify it to a level that the general audience can understand. If you have questions later, be sure to ask, but I'll do my best to make it as simple as I can. And I won't share everything there is. There's a lot of genetics out there on this topic, so just be aware that we're just going to touch it barely. And I want to start because this is where, as a geneticist, I have my first, what should I, whoops, two slides too far. There we go. As a geneticist, when I look at this text, and this is our kind of our founding text, so to speak, as Christians, and of course as Jews there as well. And it's from Genesis, of course, and this is the creation of humans. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and every living creature that moves on the ground. And then the second part of that, in chapter 2, we get some details. And it says, then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. Now, as a geneticist, when I read this text, there are a lot of questions that immediately pop out, and here are a few of them. First off, what is the genetic difference between a man and a woman? Okay, and I'm asking that question in the context of this text, actually, and because today I can answer that question, of course. If Eve was made from Adam's rib, wouldn't that make her a clone? Okay, so again, my genetic mind. If Eve was a clone of Adam, then how could she be a different sex? Was Eve maybe intersex? Okay, so, and we'll talk about what intersex means. Some of you already know what it is. If everything in Eden was, quotes, perfect as created, then wouldn't Adam and Eve's children have to be clones of them? So these are, from a genetics perspective, these are really profound questions, because if there had never been a fall, what would have happened to humankind? How would genetics have actually worked? So to discuss that, I'm going to take you to one of my slides I use in my classroom as we discuss how sex is determined. And I'm sure everybody here is well acquainted with the idea that men are XY and women are XX. And on this slide to the right here, you can see that displayed quite nicely. And but it also, for my genetics students, for my biology students, when I teach this, I also point out to them that this is not the only sex determination system. Throughout nature, there's a variety of others. And you can look here, some insects there at the bottom. I kind of think the birds are kind of interesting, because notice that in those, it is the female that has the unmatched sex chromosomes. And so we have females that are ZW, males are ZZ. But there's some assumptions behind that human part of that diagram right there that we often don't think about. And so I'm going to state them up front. On the left here, you can see males are XY. Okay, what that means, they're chromosomally male. We then make these assumptions that when somebody is chromosomally male, they're also, they have male primary and secondary anatomy. Okay, so they have the sex organs we expect and the secondary sex characteristics, that they're male gendered, and that they're sexually attracted to females. These are all assumptions we tend to make when we talk about sex determination. And likewise for the female there, you can see my list. It's essentially the same list, but now it's for the female. And so as we look at those are the assumptions that we often make as soon as we see that. Now I want to pull that apart, and I'm going to use a diagram here just to sort of help me with that. There are four aspects, four, say, characteristics or pieces that make up what we call sex and gender. And I've listed these here: chromosomal sex, phenotypic sex, in other words, what you look like; gender identity, so in other words, how do you behave in terms of what sex you are; and then how what your sexual orientation is. And I want to point out that each of these four, and I've given them as a scale. On the left is male, the opposite we often consider female, and you see that on left and right. The middle area is actually inhabited by some people, because you'll often hear people say, oh, there's only male and female. That's all there is. There's nothing else. Well, in actuality, no, that's not true. There are people that fall all along the spectrum between male and female. And they aren't even necessarily all lined up in the same place on all four of these axes, because it turns out that each four of these parts of our sex and gender develop at different times during fetal development. And so someone can be, for example, can be intersex, but they can be phenotypically male. And you wouldn't be able to tell that they're not male, in spite of the fact their chromosomal sex may in fact not be male. It might be, well, intersex, something in between. And we also, these days, most of you have probably heard the term non-binary. There are people who consider themselves to not be either gender. They are gender queer, is one of the terms that I put there on that axis. So they're somewhere in the middle, and they may be, chromosomally male, and they might even be, as far as their phenotypic sex, totally male as well, but they may consider themselves to be somewhere between male and female. And this is probably a psychological, I shouldn't say psychological, I should say neurological condition. People see themselves as their brain says they are, okay? And the brain may in fact be neither male nor female, because the brain development part of this picture happens at a different time as well. And then sexual orientation, a person could be, attracted to males. They're male, they're attracted to males. They could be male and attracted to females. There's various possibilities there, or in the middle there, bisexual. So we need to keep in mind that all of these four aspects of sex and gender are happening in overlapping periods during development, and thus may not all line up as our assumptions were at the very beginning there, that we have what's called a cis male individual who has all the male sex parts, who is male gender-wise and is attracted to females. It may not turn out that way. And such outcomes of development are not, I would say, not abnormal. They're actually normal. They're normal outcomes of the way that our development takes place. Some of them can be driven by genes. And that's what this next slide is. And this is a complicated picture here. I don't expect anybody to totally understand it. I only put it here for two reasons. One is to show the complexity of it. What sex you are and all of the outcomes of that is a complicated process that involves a large list of individual genes. And I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here. So we start at the top up here, and you can see things, a series of genes listed here. All these genes have acronyms, and many of them I don't even know the names of myself. But each of these genes is playing a part in the very first steps in producing the sexual structures. And then notice there's one over here that kind of I want to highlight called the SRY gene. That's essentially the master switch. That gene, if it's possessed and it's on the Y chromosome. And so generally, if a person has a Y chromosome, they develop as male because that switch causes the development of the testes. And once the testes are developed, they control a bunch of other genes that are then in charge of producing the various sexual organs, and secondary sex characteristics are controlled by hormones, etc. If there is no SRY gene, the developing embryo then goes to the female direction. And so that's the simple switch. The problem is that switch is not the only thing that determines all of the aspects of our sex and gender. All these other genes that you see listed here in this big list up here at the top, which can have mutations in them, can change how the outcomes are. Which brings me to, in some ways, one of the more controversial aspects of today's presentation, and that is mutations. I think that the general thought for most Christians is that before the fall, there were no mutations. Everything was perfect. Okay, now think about that for a moment, though. If there were no mutations, and I'm a geneticist, so I'm going to approach this from that perspective, all of the phenotypic variation we see in humans, so different eye color, different hair color, different body shapes, different personality, all these things are due to, at least in part, to genetic variation. And we would not have all of these different characteristics in the human population if it weren't for that genetic variation. And genetic variation, by the way, is only produced by mutation. So now, if we assume that all humans descended from a single pair, Adam and Eve, which is our standard story, if there had been no mutations at all, essentially, we would not see anything but minor morphological differences in the human population that would be driven by environmental effects, in other words. In a way, we'd all, in fact, be clones of Adam and Eve if there had been no genetic variation caused by, the only way we know genetic variation is caused is by mutation. So mutations are essential for producing human diversity. Now, problem. As a geneticist, and I can tell you this, most mutations are detrimental. They usually cause problems. But without mutations, there'd be no variation. So I kind of call this a catch-22. What do? You have to have mutations to get variation, but most mutations are detrimental. And my question is, can you even conceive of a genetic system without mutations? And thus the question, would God have allowed mutations before the fall? Now, I don't have a complete answer for that. I think there must have been mutations before the fall, but it does bring up that problem then. What about those detrimental mutations? Well, if you want an out, I can give you one. We could say God simply prevented detrimental mutations. That's one possibility. If we want to go that route, I don't know if that's the answer, but that is one possibility. Now, another, of course, difficulty we may have as we think about this is if Eve was made as described in Genesis 2 from Adam's rib, God would have had to then maybe, as I say, do some genetic engineering because Adam had an X and a Y chromosome. And in order for Eve to be female, she needed to have two X's. So what happened to the Y chromosome? Well, one possibility is, God zapped that Y chromosome, gave her a genetically engineered second X chromosome, possibly. I should also point out that males and females, that is really the only significant difference, genetically speaking, because all the other chromosomes, we have the same genes. We share all the same genes across our genome, across all our chromosomes. Now, regardless of how God might have produced Eve in this process, and I don't know how God did this. I suspect some genetic engineering had to be involved, but regardless of that, mutations are still essential for human population development. If we want to develop a population of humans that have diversity, differences, we're going to have mutations. So even if detrimental mutations are a result of the fall, which some may still want to say, neutral or beneficial mutations need not be, and I think must have been present before the fall. And thus, if the outcome of a mutation is neutral or beneficial, then should we even say that it is somehow the result of the fall? So I don't think mutations as a process should be considered completely always detrimental. because they do produce positive or at least neutral outcomes in many cases. That brings me to intersex individuals. And I want to be careful about the language here because these are real people. And I think we need to be aware that when we talk about these things, about LGBTQ plus issues, that we're talking about real individuals. And this has been a very contentious area, the study of intersex. And you can even see it in this table, because you notice the table 1, it says disorders of disorders. Well, I'm going to use the term differences. And in fact, if I had been able to find a better table of a more recent publication, they would probably have used that term, differences of sexual development, because the intersex community has pointed out that by using the term disorder, that puts aspersion on them as a group. So I'm going to use the term differences of sexual development. And I've underlined 2 of these. There's a whole bunch here, and all of these represent cases of either chromosomal differences, where the individual has different numbers of chromosomes, mostly the sex chromosomes, or their individual mutations. And I've underlined 2 of those, Turner syndrome there on the left and androgen insensitivity on the right, which I will be looking at in more detail later. And here's just another table just showing some of the outcomes. Again, I'm not expecting you to study this in detail today. And we're clearly not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to just show you the variety of the outcomes of what are called these differences in sexual development. And they do result in individuals who have characteristics that clearly are not either completely male or completely female. So let's focus in on, one last thing. Historically, when a baby was born with some sort of intersex condition, then a panel of doctors would be brought in of different specialties to look at this baby and try and figure out what sex should be assigned to that infant. And this is actually taken from a textbook showing the things that are used to determine that. Everything from looking at the clitoris, is it a normally shaped sized clitoris, or is it a penis, or is it something in between? And you'll notice there's a lot of in between stuff there. So there's not, a baby can be born with things that we're not sure. It's sort of like a clitoris, but it's almost a penis. So what do you do? And so there's other things. You can see a list of other things there, other anatomical things that can be used that doctors would use. Also on the lower right, there's a thing called hypospadias, and that may be a term to non-medical people that you're not acquainted with. Hypospadias are when the urethra exits the penis exits the penis basically at a location other than the tip. Okay, so it's coming out somewhere else. And those are also often considered to be intersex conditions as well, and could be surgically repaired, of course. In fact, in some cases, if it causes difficulty, it may need to be. Now, at this point in time, most infants that are born with intersex conditions, we're straying away from trying to determine the sex or to assign the sex at birth. And often now the recommendation is to raise the child as intersex and wait until they are old enough to begin to involve themselves in the conversation about what gender they may want to be assigned, or even if they want to be assigned one. There are now intersex individuals who are comfortable with being intersex and want to remain so without surgical intervention. So just be aware that these are real people that have struggled with this issue, and some of them have been hurt terribly by the medical community historically. And I think we're doing better, and it's good to see that. How many babies are like this? Sometimes I've heard people, when I talk about this topic, they say, oh, but that's hardly anybody. Almost nobody falls into this category. Well, if you go with the lowest estimates, yes. That lowest estimate on the upper left there, where it says right over here, the 0.18% of births. Yes, that's pretty rare. But really, if it's rare, we don't care. I think these are individuals, these are people, and we need to have compassion and empathy for them as well. That low number is for those who really just want to avoid classifying anybody in this category, and it involves the ones that are the most obvious intersex. Others have estimated as large as 10%. I think that's probably unrealistically large, but anyway, that's some estimates have been there. The most reasonable or realistic estimates are about 1.7. So 1.7% of the children born are some form of intersex. And the differences between this 0.018 and 10% and this more realistic term, have to do with how you define intersex. And I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I think the 1.7% is probably the most realistic, and that's pretty significant. That's almost 2 out of 100 births. So it's not a, it's a small number, but it's not that small. I want to take time today and describe 2 of these conditions in detail, so you can get some understanding of what intersex individuals deal with. And the 2 of these will be CAIS, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and then Turner syndrome, which is nowadays got given a more complex name. You can see it there, 45X46XY mosaicism. And I'll explain why that name got kind of changed over the years. And let's start with the CAIS. This is caused by a single gene mutation in a gene that is responsible for producing the androgen receptor. The androgen receptor is a protein in the membrane of a variety of cells in the body that recognizes when androgens are present, and then it responds and causes other activities in the cell. Of our interest here, androgen receptors are what cause the secondary sexual development of the fetus, including things like the penis, for example. That's very important that you have an androgen receptor, or you don't develop a penis. It develops instead as a vagina. Now, on the right, the AR gene is on the X chromosome. That's kind of interesting as well. That means it's a sex-linked trait. I'm not going to take a lot of time on sex-linked traits, but I do want to at least point out that sex-linked traits behave differently than other traits. You might know that red-green colorblindness and male pattern baldness are common X-linked traits that tend to skip generations. And so for CAIS, that is also the case. It tends to skip generations in families, kind of crops up here and there because it's carried on that X chromosome. Okay, so a child is born with this condition. They have an XY chromosome set. So they are chromosomally male. So, and they also then have an SRY gene. And because they have that gene, they develop testes. Their testes produce testosterone, as they should, but because the androgen receptor does not function, the testosterone does not masculinize the fetus. So all of the masculine secondary sexual characteristics don't develop because that androgen receptor is not functioning. And the testosterone is essentially a signal with no receptor. Now, at birth, a child with this condition will appear externally female. They have all of the, well, there's a vagina. There are the mons and other structures that go along with that. Nothing seems abnormal. They look just like a little girl. Now, if a doctor were to actually poke around a little more, look inside, he would discover, oh, there's no uterus, so there's no cervix. But generally speaking, we don't look that carefully at that point. So they're raised as girls. They don't have any ovaries. They do have testes, but they remain internal. They're in their abdominal cavity and never descend, so they stay in that location. And these children will go through a relatively normal puberty, although there will be no menses. And so that sometimes is the first time at which somebody decides something's not right here. We need to find out what's going on because no menstruation has occurred. And if the testes are retained, and of course, if nobody's discovered them yet, they're still there, other aspects of puberty do occur. So the girl will develop breasts, for example. So that's completely normal. And that's because it turns out that testosterone, when there's high amounts of it in the blood, the body converts some of that to estrogen. And so there are going to be some female effects that occur, even though there's this high testosterone. Now, the undescended testes can sometimes be problematic. They can be diagnosed as a hernia because they can become kind of painful at some point because the body wants to, do what testes normally do and descend, but they can't. And so a doctor may be poking around and figuring out why this hernia here, and then discover, there's testes. Now, historically, they would remove the testes because of perceived risk of cancer. More current research has discovered that the cancer is less likely than they thought. And so often the testes are left there, which is a good idea because at least it helps the other aspects of development to take place more or less normally. And generally speaking, the gender choice for these children, even though they're intersex, because notice they are XY chromosome, they're male chromosomally, they generally choose female. And that's primarily because they were raised as females all the way along. So to them, it seems perfectly normal. And many of them want to be considered female. And chances are you may actually know somebody with this condition and they won't, they're not going to talk about this. This is very sensitive information. Uh, they will be female as any other female you know. So there's nothing that really would set that off. Now, sometimes female hormones do have to be administered during puberty to produce the secondary sex characteristics if the testes are removed, for example. And sometimes an additional hormone occasionally needs to be administered as well because it may not go as normal. Now, male gender is rarely chosen. There's been a few cases where CIS, they will choose a male gender, but there's a lot of problems with that because there are no anatomical traits consistent with that. So it, of course, requires some extensive surgery. And so often they don't choose that. But occasionally that does show up. And of course, being XY, you might expect, yeah, that could maybe influence that. So here's the overall picture that someone with CIS is chromosomally male, physically intersex. So they have a little bit of female trait, a little bit of male. They're generally gendered female, often raised that way and choose that direction. And they're most often sexually attracted to males. So here's my question. And this is, an interesting question, I think. So if someone with CIS marries by their own inclination, they will marry a man. So my question is this a same-sex marriage? Now you can think about that one for a while. And I would say it's an inappropriate question, of course, because wait a minute, this person's intersex. But okay, so then what do we call this? Well, maybe we don't need to call it anything. Let's go on to the next one. Turner syndrome. Now, Turner syndrome used to be believed that it was just having a single X chromosome, and that was the end of the story. So we called these people XO. They had X and nothing else. We now know that these individuals are actually mosaics. Some of their cells will have a single X chromosome. Others will have an XY, most commonly, sometimes XX, but most commonly XY. And a mosaic, if you're not acquainted with the term, is a person that is composed of two chromosomally different types of cells. And I still remember, I think, a case that was kind of fascinating, a CSI case. When you watch the CSI program, that somebody had committed a crime and he turned out to be a mosaic person that was composed of two different sets of cells. And they couldn't catch the right guy because they had the wrong sample of cells from what he left at the scene of the crime. So these people do exist, not just Turner syndrome, but mosaics of other sorts. Now, people with this condition are usually born with a male appearance. So overall, Turner syndrome children are born male, but they're often shorter than average, and their testes, dysgenic testes, meaning they don't develop properly, and they're consequently usually sterile as a result. So we might usually, look at, oh, yeah, they're male. And if we didn't dig any further, they're male, just a little odd, but but they're male for the most part. But because some are also born with female appearance and who also have gonadal dysgenesis, in this case, what we call streak ovaries and a poorly formed uterus, there's not a consistent outcome here. So again, this is an intersex condition. Also during puberty, those with Turner syndrome are not uncommonly experience gender dysphoria. So they're not sure what gender they are. Now, gender assignment at birth, which historically was done, is rather complicated. And historically, genital surgeries were often done to make physical appearance match the gender of choice, which was many times female, occasionally male. If there was any kind of penis at all, they would then more likely choose male, but often it was female. But that's problematic because these children might later not be comfortable with that original choice. Now, one factor that did prompt genital surgeries historically was not just assignment of gender or sex, but it was also this higher perceived risk of cancer because, like for the CAIS condition, dysgenic gonads were believed to possibly cause a greater risk of cancer. And there is some risk of it. But again, we have now discovered it's less than we thought. So usually we take a wait and see approach because it is beneficial to retain the testes for the testosterone that they produce to at least allow for as normal development as possible. So we generally now, for Turner syndrome children, will delay gender assignment till much later, often at least till puberty or later, where they can decide what they want to be done with their bodies. Regardless then of chosen gender, let's now look at the Turner syndrome individual. They are chromosomally intersex. Okay, so they XO is not a specific sex chromosomally. They're physically intersex in many cases, often with a little bit of both male and female traits, and they have an uncertain gender. Now, as far as sexual attraction, there's not a particular rule here, so I'll go to now this question on the right-hand side here. So if a gender female, and this is just one example, identified individual with this condition marries a man, is that a heterosexual marriage, or is it a same-sex marriage? You see how we get hung up on categorizing these things, and I think we're going to get ourselves in trouble. And I'm going to suggest that not only do we get ourselves in trouble in the case of intersex individuals, but I think we do with gay people as well, and with trans people and so on. So with that setup, I'm going to suggest that these intersex conditions we just looked at, and these are real people, that I think we need to look at with love and compassion and try to empathize with them. These conditions, we know they are genetically based. These are genetically driven. There is no doubt. And so we feel because of that they do deserve to be treated with great respect and understanding. And so as a church, what do we do for them? Well, I don't know yet. The church hasn't really said a great deal about this group. But I think most of us would feel like we should treat them, at least in terms of their relationship status, just like anybody else, and allow them to marry and associate as they would. Now, I don't know that everybody says that, but I think that seems like it's sensible if you look at it from a genetic standpoint. Now, although intersex individuals are atypical, and I want to use that term, their bodies still represent a normal, genetically based outcome. It's different than the rest of us, most assuredly, but it's not abnormal. Okay, so I think another thing we need to do is to help these individuals realize that this is normal. They're okay. And I'm especially sensitive to that personally because I was born myself with a genetic defect, not one that's related to one sex. It's my fingers, and those that have known me maybe have seen my fingers, but this is called amniotic band syndrome. And so I never felt like I was abnormal. I'm normal. I'm just different. And I think we need to consider that that's an important way to help individuals feel more connected with the rest of us as humanity. We need to see them as normal. Now, acceptance of intersex individuals as normal, I believe, opens the door to understanding gay and trans people, because what I'm going to now talk about is what we know from genetics about gay and trans people. Although we don't have unequivocal genetic data to say, oh yes, here's the genetic reason somebody's gay, we have many, many, many pieces of evidence that support at least a large part of what it is to be gay or trans is driven by genetics. Now, a few definitions before we go on, just in case some of you don't know the alphabet for the LGBTQ community. The letters actually have meaning. Lesbian, L is lesbian, G, gay, B, bisexual. Bisexual for somebody that is attracted to both sexes, and so they don't have a specific attraction to one or the other. Transgender, somebody who is one sex but perceives themselves, their brain basically is telling them they are the other sex. Queer is a general term that kind of encompasses all, and in fact, some of the LGBTQ plus community has even suggested we scrap the whole alphabet, just call everybody in the community queer. That was an epithet at one time historically, but has been embraced by the community. Not everybody's as comfortable with that as others, so that's why it hasn't caught on for everybody. Intersex, of course, we've just been talking about that. And then there's even a group today called asexual, and there's a further letters in this alphabet, which I won't take time for, but asexual individuals are kind of interesting because they don't have any sense of sexual attraction typically, or they may have a small amount. Doesn't mean they're not sexual, but they often also feel ostracized because people think there's something wrong with them because they don't have sexual attraction. Now, my question is there any evidence that biology accounts for these other sexuality and gender categories like it does for intersex? And my short answer is yes. Okay, we're done. There it is. The answer is yes. I have a longer answer, and I'm trying to become famous here, so that's why I call these Ness's developmental aphorism and Ness's corollary. So I'm a professor. I'm going for the Nobel Prize here. So at any rate, two aphorisms that I want to bring up. It would be surprising if there were not some people born who are sexually attracted to members of their own sex. In other words, as a geneticist, I look at this, if there weren't gay people, I would be like scratching my head. They should exist based on what I know about genetics. And then the corollary to that, it would also be surprising if there were not some people born whose gender is opposite to their chromosomal and or physical sex. Again, because from a genetics perspective, we would expect, because all of the 4 categories of sex and gender that I brought up earlier on are controlled by different sets of genes. They develop at different times during fetal development and so on. So I would expect that there could be some mismatches. They should be there. So I'm not surprised that there are people that are trans. I would be surprised if there were not. And so that's what that point is. So let's look at the evidence from genetics now for people being gay and so on. Is there any genetic evidence? Well, first of all, gender and sexual orientation are determined at different times during development. So just a reiteration of that. So we expect some outcomes. Now, same-sex attraction has a heritability of 30 to 50%. Now, some of you may not know the term heritability. It's a slippery word. Even geneticists have a hard time understanding it properly. In a rough sense, what heritability means is that the variation we observe in the genes versus the outcomes, 30 to 50% of the variation we observe in the outcomes are explained by the genes themselves. Now, in a rough sense, we could say then, okay, 30 to 50% of the effects, okay, and this is only partially true in the way I'm stating it, but it's enough to make sense. 30 to 50% of the effects on someone are due to their genes in regard to same-sex attraction. So that's a recognition, by the way, that a person who is gay partly due to genes, partly due to environment. Now, careful here, I'll talk about environment later, but the point is genes play a big part. We think 30 to 50%. Now, there's also another way we can look at this, ignoring genes themselves and asking the question, how much genes, how much environment? We could look at twins. And there's a thing called concordance. And if I look at twins, we find that among male monozygotic twins, 25 to 52% of them are both gay. When one is gay, the other is gay, in other words. I'm not saying that all male twins are gay. It's just that when there's one gay, 25 to 52% of the time, the other one is also gay. Among male siblings that are, and when I say siblings here, I mean dizygotic twins. I should have stated it that way. Only 13 to 17%. It also holds for male siblings, by the way. So there's an excess in monozygotic twins. Why? Because they share the same genes. And so we expect that their outcomes, if genes are running the show to any degree, that would happen more often. And so as expected, if being gay is driven by genes, yes, monozygotic twins show up higher. Here's a table that shows a much larger picture of that. And there's been a lot of research on this, a lot of quibbling, a lot of people have argued against it, but every time a new study is done, it still comes out the same. And the overall, I'm just going to look down here at the very bottom here, the median for all studies, and notice at the top up here are selected studies, and these are registry studies, meaning this was people did surveys and saying, have you got a gay brother? We want to study your family. And then they tried to compare it to other gays, and they find a much higher occurrence. But if they just go to the registry, just go to a birth registry and find all the twins and check them all out, even then, 25% of monozygotic twins, if one is gay, the other is gay, whereas only 13% of dizygotic twins. So there's clearly a genetic influence here. Pretty significant genetic influence due to being a twin, because they share the same genes. Okay, moving on from there, Another thing that's been observed over the years, again, this has been quibbled about, but every time a new study is done, it comes out to still be true. For each boy a woman conceives after her first, there is an additional 33% chance that each succeeding boy will be gay. Now, the background occurrence is 7 to 8%. So each boy that's born, about a 7 to 8% chance that they'll be gay. Whereas if it's a boy that's born after other boys, each generation that ratchets up and the percentage is higher. Okay. So, and we can see this here in this graph here. Somebody is actually now, well, many labs have now been studying this. And why is that? Why is it that as a woman has more boys, that she ends up with, higher likelihood of gays from later boys? And the theory now is, and it seems to be pretty solid, is that the mother produces antibodies against some of the proteins that the boy producing in utero, because some of those proteins enter the mother's blood, and she sets up antibodies against those. And some of these proteins are involved in brain development on sexual orientation, and her antibodies are attacking those. And so it turns out that as her antibodies attack those, that makes it more likely the child will end up being gay. So after one child, if she has no sons, by the way, they've actually checked the mother's blood for these antibodies. She has low levels of those antibodies. If she has a couple of sons and both of them are straight, turns out, yeah, her levels are kind of low. On the other hand, as soon as gay sons start showing up, her levels have risen and they keep going up the more children she has. So we're pretty certain at this point that one of the big influences on sexual attraction, the development of sexual attraction, may in fact be this antibody response from the mother. And so, and there's some evidence that even females can be affected to some degree by this. So that's a little bit controversial at this point. Okay, another area is actually looking at genes themselves. There have been several GWAS studies, those genome-wide association studies. A little hard to explain what this means, but it's essentially looking at markers throughout the human genome, and you're looking for association between individual markers along the chromosomes and whether the person is gay or not. And several GWAS studies have found genes that are associated with individuals who engage in same-sex sexual activity. Now, notice I use that terminology because it's a little hard to prove somebody is, quotes, gay, but we can ask them if they have, been involved in same sexual activity, and there's a high correlation. Now, the genes discovered have functions that can plausibly tie them to the development of sexual attraction. Some of these genes have to do with olfaction, which we know has something to do with sexual attraction and response. A few of them had to do with brain development in areas of the brain that we already have suspected have something to do with sexual attraction. So there's really some strong evidence here. There was a really large study done recently, and I want to really focus on this one just for a moment. It was in 2019, published in the journal Science, which is the premier journal in the United States. You don't get published in Science unless you really have some amazing results, and they did. They had a sample of 477,522 individuals, and they discovered 5 genes that were linked to individuals that engage in same-sex sexual behavior. And so and by the way, the term gay gene, I hope nobody brings that up. I'm going to do it for you. There is no such thing as a gay gene. What we're saying here is that there are genes that influence the development of sexual attraction, and it's likely hundreds of genes. We've only found a few so far, 5 in this study, there's a few in other studies and so on. There's probably hundreds of genes that are involved with this. And all of them have small effects. They probably interact. And so it's a very complex thing. So if anybody's looking for exactly how somebody is gay based on their genes, we're probably never going to find that. But we do know that genes are involved, and that it's probably a very different set of genes for some gay people versus other gay people. Okay, so we can't just say, look at your genome and say, oh yeah, you're gay. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, that's never going to happen. But genes have something to do with it, and probably quite a bit to do with it when it's all said and done. Okay, there's some other studies of brains, people's brains, looking at them, and there's been lots of brain structures that have been suggested to be different in gays versus non-gay individuals. One that's been a specific focus is this one here, the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. In gays, it is about the same size as it is in heterosexual females, suggesting that that it causes them to be attracted to males just like females are attracted to males. Which brings up another point, by the way, because in scientific circles, it's often talked about who you're attracted to, not whether it's same sex or not. It's just, are you attracted to males or are you attracted to females? Without any, and that kind of, I think that takes some of the judgment out of it. But at any rate, this is fairly consistent at this point. And it also looks like it's part of one of the genes that has been discovered. Actually, a couple of them are involved in the development of this portion of the brain. I haven't said a lot about transgender individuals. I do want to mention that they also have shown up in some of the studies. There's less known about transgender, but we do know some things. The brains of transgender individuals usually resemble more the brains of their gender identity than the gender that matches their physical appearance. Okay, and that includes normally sex-specific differences in the hypothalamic uncinate nucleus and that INAH3 again that we saw for gays. Now, I want to give you a word of caution here. This doesn't mean that I can pull up a brain scan and say, oh yes, this person's trans. We're talking about trends here. This is an average. In other words, on average, transgender brains are different than people that are not trans, and they're more similar to the gender that they of which they identify. It doesn't mean that every single transgender individual could be nailed with their brain scan. In fact, if you look at male-female brain scans, there's so much overlap that I couldn't look at a brain and tell you whether it's a male or female brain in most cases. So, and of course, I'm not into neurology, so I couldn't anyway. So, anyway, also gay and transgender individuals can usually trace the roots of their sexual and gender orientation to early childhood. In other words, the attraction is there even before they become sexual, before they even think about sex. There's already beginning to show signs of that, and they can often trace that back in their lives and recall these things. And then male children born with severely malformed penis who are reassigned female at birth, and this used to be done, a lot, and who have surgery to form female-like sex parts because they basically reassign them, almost invariably are sexually attracted to females. So in other words, there's something inborn about who you're attracted to. We've known this. We're learning this just more as we go along. And then lastly, I think it deserves to be pointed out, gay conversion therapy has been a resounding failure. So much so that now many states have banned it. And the failure of conversion therapy essentially suggests that sexual orientation is usually fixed and cannot be changed. I mean, whether or not you're born with it, you still can't change it, okay? We think you're born with it, though. Now, people might argue, well, wait a minute, you can't be born with sexual attraction. Babies aren't sexually attracted. Well, you know what? Babies aren't tall either. But they have the genes to be tall, and they will probably be tall later, right? So, I mean, we need to realize that, having it inborn doesn't mean you express it at that age, but it will show up later. So, back to that question, is sexual and gender orientation genetic? Well, again, from a genetic perspective, hardly any complex human trait is purely the result of genetics. So no, it's not just genetic. So sexual and gender orientation are likely not caused solely by genetics, but the consensus among geneticists is that sexual and gender orientation are not the result of are the result of a highly complex interaction between genetics, epigenetics, and environment. Okay, now watch out for that environment word. Most people hear that and think, oh, environment, that means how you're brought up, when you're a kid. That's not what that means from a genetic perspective. Word on epigenetics first and then to environment, but epigenetics, you may have heard about it. These are effects that don't involve the actual change in genes. It's just the way they're expressed. We know that epigenetics plays a part in other areas. Some of you may be aware of the Dutch hunger studies that came out of World War II, where they found that individuals that were conceived and born during World War II, when the Dutch were in a famine due to the war, that those children, when they grew up, had a much higher tendency to be obese. And when they started studying their genes, they discovered they had genetic markers, methylation markers on their genes called epigenetic markers that seemed to be driving that change. And they even pass those on at least one further generation. So there may be some epigenetic effects that also happen in terms of sexual orientation. That's still undergoing a lot of research, but it's quite an interesting area. Now, to environment. Environment includes effects external to the individual's own body, beginning with the intrauterine world. Okay, so that's where it starts. And in fact, from a genetic perspective, we believe that most of the environmental effects actually happen in the uterus, not post-birth. In fact, many studies have tried to show that there are effects later after birth, and there's just not been very good evidence. It just doesn't come out. And so right now, most of the focus is on genes and intrauterine environment. And so now what do we do? Okay, so I've just brought up a bunch of stuff now that probably is going to clash with our theology. If you haven't already thought, maybe I've stepped over that line. So I want to reiterate back to our history as a church and just remind ourselves that Ellen White did once say, rightly understood, science and the written word agree, and each sheds light on the other. Together, they lead us to God by teaching us something of the wise and beneficent laws through which he works. Okay, I suggest we take that statement seriously. Notice the word together. Notice agree. Okay, sure, they should agree. So what do we do if they don't agree? Well, for some people, if they don't agree, we just say the Bible's right and science is wrong. And I'm not real comfortable with that as a scientist. For me, if the above is true, then when we find a conflict between the two, it signifies a need to reevaluate both sources. We need to go back to our theology. Maybe we need to go back to our science too, okay? I mean, both of them. Science is largely objective, though. It's an objective source of knowledge. There's lots of checks and balances there. Most of what we know from science is going to turn out to be true, okay? Sorry, but I'm a scientist, so I have to say that. So if it conflicts with theology, it may mean that the theology needs revision. So I think we really seriously have to say, yeah, let's look at our theology. Now, if LGBTQ plus is primarily inborn, as I am suggesting, it ought to be considered a normal biological outcome. In fact, this would mean that saying that someone is gay means that their nature is to be attracted to someone of their own sex. They are that way by nature. That's their normal. That's their normal way of being human. Okay. Now, if normal, and it does not cause harm, okay, its consequences should be allowed. This is what I believe. And LGBTQ plus individuals should be given the freedom to embody who they are. So this brings us to this three questions. Three answers to the question that I'm asking. What should the church do? Now, there are many other possible directions, I'm sure, but here are the three broad paths. We could discount the scientific evidence. Don't believe it. And continue to claim that same-sex attraction, gender nonconformity is a choice that the Bible considers a sin. So that's an option. We could go that route. And this second one here is somewhat more of what we've been doing a little bit in North America, accept the scientific evidence, continue to consider same-sex sexual relations and gender nonconformity as a sin, nevertheless, and accept such individuals into church membership if they remain celibate. Not sure how well that's actually worked, because I know some people who tried that route and they still ended up being ostracized often, and still could not as easily be involved in the church, in any substantive way. So I'm not sure how that's actually working, and I have many questions about it anyway. Or we could go the third route, accept the scientific evidence and treat those with same-sex attraction and who are gender nonconforming exactly like everyone else, expecting them to refrain from premarital and extramarital sex and expecting them to marry if they choose to and remain monogamous. Okay, that's the church's view about sexuality anyway. Why don't we just open that for everybody, regardless of what sexuality they have? I'm going to give you one last tidbit here in support of that third argument. And I call this the simple argument in defense of LGBTQ marriage and equality. And I got it from a source that I'll show at the end here, which I think has some really good ideas, a great book to read if you want to read about the moral aspects of this. So number one, if something is morally wrong, okay, so to me, if you're going to say that people that are same sex can't marry, there must be something morally wrong with it. So let's see if that can even be sustained. So for an action or practice to be morally wrong, it must have some wrong-making feature. In other words, if an action is morally wrong, there must be something about the action that makes it wrong. Okay, I think we can all agree on that. Wrong-making features include the following. The action or practice, one, causes harm, or two, violates some competent person's autonomy, or three, is unfair, or four, violates someone's individual rights, or we could add to that list, okay, so etc. The second premise can be extended. It should include an exhaustive list of features that make an action or practice morally wrong. And believe me, there are people who have made a long list for this topic. But I can tell you, if you go through the whole list, there doesn't seem to be any wrong-making feature. So number three, same-sex sexual relations between two consenting adults do not have any of these features. In other words, one, it is not harmful. Two, it does not violate anyone's autonomy. Three, it is not unfair. Four, it does not violate anyone's individual rights. Five, and again, etc. And I think if you go through any list, and I've seen many lists, believe me, I've had people try and convince me of that, none of them represent a problem. This, of course, is not to say that same-sex sexual relations can never be morally wrong. For example, if a man is married to a woman and has secret same-sex liaisons on the side, that would be morally wrong, because obviously he's, causing injury to her. But it is not the same-sex sexual behavior per se that makes such behavior morally wrong. What makes it wrong is that it involves betrayal and the violation of one's marriage vows. It is wrong because it is adultery, not because it is gay adultery. Therefore, same-sex relations between mutually consenting adults are not morally wrong. Okay. This argument is obviously valid. To say that an argument is valid means that if the premises 1 through 3 are true, then the conclusion 4 must be true. The conclusion might still be false, but only if at least one of the premises 1 through 3 is false. So I make the argument that from strictly moral, philosophical grounds, there is nothing wrong with same-sex relations and same-sex marriage. And I would extend that. Of course, this argument comes from a book that's dealing specifically with same-sex issues. I would extend this also to gender nonconformity, so that trans individuals are also, there is nothing there that is morally wrong either. So that is my conclusion. Last slide here, I want to just, if you want to take a picture of this slide, so you can look these up later, but here's some books that I recommend if you want to know more about some of these issues. The one that's the most scientific of the list is the one towards the bottom of the list, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, which by Simon LeVay, and there's actually a second edition now. Yeah, I did note that. There's also a new book just out. And if some of you have been on Spectrum yesterday, you saw I just put a book review up actually there on Alicia Johnson's new book, The Bible and LGBTQ Adventists, which I can definitely recommend to everyone as well. But there